Captain Murphy's old Skylark stopped in a residential area up in Harwood Heights, a place that still looked as empty and hollow and gray as the rest of the city. It was an odd home for Chicago. A white stucco number with a red tile roof looked like it had been transplanted from Southern California. In the steady rain and the mournful gray light of the street lamps, it sat cold, lonely, and empty of purpose amongst more traditional homes that surrounded it. The Buick's windshield wipers thumped rhythmically. "Once you get out," Captain Murphy said, "there's no coming back. You're on your own." "Been there, done that," I said. I offered him my hand. "Thank you, Captain." He traded grips with me. I didn't try and out-crush him. He didn't try and crush me. The men who can really handle themselves rarely do. I wish Captain Murphy had lived long enough for me to meet him in the real world. I had a feeling he'd have made one hell of an ally. "I might be in touch with Karen," I said. "No messages. I've done her harm enough," he said, almost before I had finished speaking. His voice carried a tone of unquestionable finality. He nodded toward the house. "But you can tell the big fellow over there that I sent you. It might help." I nodded. Then I took a deep breath, opened the door of the car, and stepped out into... I was actually more impressed with what I hadn't stepped into for a moment, because when my feet hit the ground and the car door shut behind me, I wasn't standing in Chicago's rainy, abandoned corpse. Instead, I was on a city street on a cold, clear evening. No rain fell, the stars and moon burned bright overhead, and the ambient city light combined with a fairly fresh snowfall to make it nearly as bright as daylight outside. Sounds rushed all around me: traffic, distant horns, the thumping beat of music from a large stereo. A jet's passage left a hollow roar behind it. I was standing only a few miles from O'Hare. I turned to look behind me, but Captain Murphy's car had vanished back into Chicago between, presumably. I stood there alone. I sighed. Then I turned and walked onto the property of Mortimer Lindquist, ectomancer. Once upon a time, Morty had covered his lawn with decorations meant to be intimidating and spooky. Headstones, a wrought iron fence with a big metal gate, eerie lighting. Your wall impression could be scary if you were gullible enough and the lighting was low, and mostly it looked like cheap Halloween decorations outside a crack house. Times had changed. Morty had gotten rid of all the cheap junk except for the fence. He turned his front yard into a Japanese garden. There were a few hedges, a koi pond, complete with a little wooden bridge that spanned it. Planters everywhere contained bonsai, all of them trees native to North America. It was a little unnerving to see what looked like an adult oak tree, only 15 inches high and complete with miniature leaves. There weren't a lot of people in Chicago doing that for money, which implied that it was Morty's own handiwork. If so, it had taken him a lot of effort and patience to create those. I walked forward calmly, reaching out to open the gate. My hand went right through it. Yeah, I know, I was essentially a ghost, but I'd never gotten much practice with intangibility. I was used to reaching out for objects and being able to touch them. Now my hand simply tingled, as if waking up after I'd taken a nap, using it as a pillow. I pushed my arm a little farther forward, leaning to one side, and saw my fingertips emerge from the metal on the gate. I waggled my fingers, just to be sure they were mine. "Okay," I said. "No help for it, then." I took a deep breath and held it as if I was about to jump into deep water. Then I hunched my shoulders and rushed forward. Anticlimax. As I went through the gate, I was subjected to a swift, intense tingling sensation. Then I was on the other side. I walked up a little stone path leading to Morty's front door, but it wasn't until I had gone over the bridge that I saw a man standing in the shadows on the front porch. I mean, he was huge. I mean, not built like a weightlifter or anything, just a naturally big-boned, brawny man standing almost as tall as I. His dark hair was gathered at the nape of his neck with a bit of ribbon. A long, dark blue coat fell to his calves, its sleeves marked with gold braid. Beneath that, he wore a uniform, a tighter-fitting blue jacket, white shirt, white tights, and high black boots. He carried some kind of long-handled axe over one shoulder, and as I came to a halt, he was already drawing a flintlock pistol from his belt with a free hand. He leveled it just a little bit to one side of me and called, "Halt! Identify yourself, scoundrel, or begone!" "Scoundrel?" I asked, putting my fingers on my chest, as if distressed at the accusation. "That's a little unfair." "You've the look of a scoundrel," boomed the man, "and a dandy sprat and a ragamuffin. Though I'll admit, for all of that, you could yet be a congressman." I could see the white flash of his teeth in the dark as he smiled. "Give me a name, man." "Harry Dresden," I said in a clear tone. The barrel of the gun wavered a few more degrees away from me. "The wizard?" "The late wizard," I replied, then gestured down at myself. "The late Harry Dresden, really." "Zounds," the man said. He frowned for a moment as if in thought. It didn't look natural on him. "If you lie," he said slowly, "I can see no veritable reason for doing so, and I am inclined to shoot you. Yet, if you tell the truth, your presence here draws much mischief to my friend's house. and I am inclined to shoot you repeatedly. He nodded firmly and settled the gun's barrel onto me. Either way, he was about to shoot. I didn't know if it would re-kill me or not, but given what I experienced of the universe, it might. At the very least, I figured it would probably hurt like a son of a bitch. I had to keep the bozo from bringing the hammer down. Assuming his period outfit was authentic, that might be simple. A little rude, isn't it, to shoot me? I asked him. I'm unarmed. I've offered no violence or insult to you. I introduced myself, even, whereas you haven't even told me your name. The man in the blue coat looked suddenly abashed, and the pistol dropped slightly once more. Ah, yes, please excuse me. Societal graces were imperfectly instilled in me in my youth. That sad fact tends to be reflected in my more temperate afterlife. He straightened and literally clicked his heels together without ever moving the gun far from me, and gave me a slight bow. The late Captain Sir Stuart Winchester of the Colonial Marines. I arched an eyebrow. Sir Stuart Winchester of the Colonial Marines? He shrugged. It is a protracted Lex tale. Well, Stu, I said. With all due respect, my business here is not with you. It's with Mr. Lindquist. I hardly think so, Stu sniffed. Have you an invitation? I gave him a blank look for a moment and then said, I'm new to the whole ghost thing, but I'm damn sure you don't just send envelopes out through the U.S. Ghostal Service. You'd be surprised how many postal workers leave a shade behind, Stu countered. The routine, methinks, is what keeps them making their rounds. The poor things don't realize anything's changed. Don't change the subject, I said. I need to talk to Mort. I am sorry, sir, Stu said, but the standing order regarding the visit of any uninvited ghost is to deny them entry. And you have to follow Mort's orders? Oh, it isn't as though you could cross his threshold uninvited in any case, man, he said. Right, I said. You have to follow his orders. We are not compelled, Stu said at once, and severely. We hate him out of friendship and respect, and... He sighed and added, and boredom, ye gods, but this city pales after half a century. And I've lingered here more than 4 times that. I found myself grinning at the ghost. Stu, let me make you a promise, maybe even an oath. I come to ask Mort's help, not to harm him, and I'm reasonably sure my presence will not contribute to your ongoing sense of ennui. Stu let out a rolling belly laugh and began to speak, but the sound died off, and he stared at me thoughtfully, tapping a fingertip against the pistol. If it makes any difference, I said, Jack Murphy was the one who dropped me off here, told me to mention his name. Stuart's eyebrows shot up. I could see the thoughts racing behind his eyes. They weren't going to win any sprints, but they seemed good for the long haul. I? He pursed his lips. A good fellow. For an Irishman. I snorted. If he's ever around, you better smile when you say it. I felt a flood of intangible cold pressed against my back, as if suddenly I'd been standing in front of an industrial freezer door when it opened. I turned to see a humanoid gray form floating just above the ground, maybe 5 yards away from me and drifting closer. The details were obscure, the proportions slightly off, as if I was looking at a badly molded plastic doll. There were no real features on it, just hollow, gaping eye sockets within a sunken, nearly skull-like face, and a wide, empty mouth that hung open as if the tendons attaching the lower jaw had stretched out like old elastic bands. It moved with a kind of shuffling grace, as if it had no real weight and only needed to touch the ground to propel itself forward with its toes. It made a sound as it came, a hollow, rattled, muted gasp. It was the sound of an agonized scream that had long since run out of the breath to propel it, but tried to continue anyway. It got closer to me, and I felt colder as it did. Get back, I snapped. I mean it. The creature came forward with another little touch of its toes to the earth, as mindless and graceful as a hungry jellyfish, and a hell of a lot creepier. I took a pair of quick steps back and said, fine, be that way. I lifted my right hand, drew in my will, and snarled, Fuego! And nothing at all happened. There was no stirring of forces deep inside me. There was no current of equal parts giddy excitement, vibrating tension, and raw lightning flashing through my thoughts. There was no flash of white-hot flame that would have incinerated the apparition coming towards me. There was no magic. There was no magic! Oh, crap! I choked and reeled back as the thing's fingers raked at me with deathly grace, the sound of its strangled scream growing higher-pitched. Its fingers didn't end in nails. They just sort of trailed off into drifting shreds that were surrounded by deadly cold. Behind me, there was a mechanical sound, click-clack, of a large half-cocked trigger being pulled fully back and ready to fire. I rolled my head around in time to see Sir Stu's enormous old gun snap up to aim directly at the end of my nose. I'm sure its barrel wasn't actually as big as a train tunnel, but at the moment it sure as hell looked like it. I felt the wave of cold intensify against my back, and by the time Stu shouted, "Get down!" I was already halfway to the ground. I hit hard. Apparently, it being insubstantial didn't free me from the law of gravity or the discomfort of its unwavering enforcement. And as I did, Stu's pistol went off. Everything happened in dream time, slowly enough for me to see every detail, but happening so swiftly that I felt no matter how fast I moved, I would not be able to keep up. I was expecting the crack of a pistol round, or maybe even the hollow whomp of a large-bore black powder weapon. What I got was a roar that sounded like it had been distorted by a dozen different DJs in a mile of train tunnel. The standard plume of black powder smoke didn't emerge from the barrel. Instead, expanding concentric rings of pastel mist puffed out, swirling at their center edges as they were pulled into following the contrail of the bullet. The bullet itself was no lump of lead. It was a sphere of multicolored light that looked nearly big enough to be a golf ball. It went by a couple of feet over my head, and I swear that it felt like I got a mild sunburn just by being close to it. A deep tone, like the thrumming of an amplified bass guitar string, emanated from the sphere, vibrating through my flesh and against my bones. I turned my head in time to see the sphere smash against the chest of the attacking apparition. The not bullet plunged into its body, tearing a hole the size of my fist in its chest. A cloud of something that looked like steam poured out from the creature. Light kindled within it, almost like an old movie projector playing on the table. And I suddenly saw a flicker of shadowy images, all of them dim, warped, twisted, as if someone made a clips reel from random strips of celluloid on the cutting room floor. The images grew steadily dimmer until there was nothing left but a thinning cloud of mist. It wasn't until then that I saw that the gray form was gradually sagging like a water skin being slowly emptied. The mist vanished. All that was left of the gray creature was an ugly, colorless lump on the ground. Firm bootsteps came down the walkway from the porch, and Stu placed himself between me and the thing, whatever it had been. Though his hands were reloading the pistol, complete with powder horn and a short ramrod, his eyes swept up and down the street around us. "What the hell was that?" I asked. "Wraith," he said quietly, with a certain professional detachment in his voice. "A ghost, like you or me, who gave into despair, gave up his sense of self-reason." Are they dangerous?" "Oh, extremely so," Stu said. He turned to look down at me, "especially to someone like you." "Like me? Fresh shade? You've a paucity of experience learning to defend yourself here, and it's all but impossible for a fresh shade such as yourself to hide. There is a sense of life that clings to you." He frowned. "To you especially." "Because I'm a wizard, maybe?" Stu nodded. Likely. What would happen if, I gestured at the Wraith's remains. "It would have devoured your memories," Stu said calmly. I considered that for a moment and studied the remains almost wistfully. "I don't know, I've got some I wouldn't mind losing." Stu slid his ready pistol back into his belt. "For shades, memories are life, sustenance, and power. We are memories now, wizard." "The images in the mist," I said, "when it was dying. Those were its memories?" "Oh, aye, what was left of them." Stu moved forward and crouched over the remains. He held out his hand, palm down over them, and took a deep breath. After a few heartbeats, glowing mist began to rise from the Wraith's remains. It snaked through the air and into Stu's chest, flowing into him like water into a pool. When it was complete, he stood again and let out a sigh. "The bullet," I said. "You made it out of a memory?" "Naturally," he said, his expression filled with the gentle, distant sorrow. "A strong one. I'll make it into another bullet at some point." "Thank you," I said, "for helping me. I must admit, I did not put the poor brute down exclusively for your sake, wizard. You represent a feast for any wraith, fresh from the world of the living, still with a touch of vitality upon you, and full to bursting with fresh, unfaded memories. The wraith that ate you would become a dire creature indeed, one that could threaten the world of the living as easily as it could the world of the spirit. I won't have that." "Oh," I said. "Thanks anyway."